We've been spending time in the book of Acts. It's the history book of the New Testament. It shows the explosive growth of this Jesus movement, this explosive growth of the church. In the first century, it literally turned the world upside down. Well, we're up to chapter 17. We're going to only be looking at one verse today. We're just going to start this, but we need to start it because in the 17th chapter, the gospel message finally comes to the city of Athens. And a lot of people will tell you by this time Athens is past its prime, but it is still the intellectual capital of the world at this time. And I think there's a lot we can learn because there's much in Athens that is like our world today. So Acts chapter 17, if you want to just look at the verses in your bulletin, they're there. We're going to be looking at that in just a little bit. It was 1995, the great heat wave of 1995. For 10 days during the month of July, the temperature was triple digits. It was above 100 degrees in the city of Chicago, the Windy City. The problem was the Windy City had no wind. The Windy City is not prepared for temperatures above 100 degrees, not day after day after day. And so people who had air conditioners were running them full bore. And because of that, the power grid shut down. And many of the people who had air conditioning weren't able to use air conditioning. And people literally died. You know, I don't know how often you watch the news and hear these things, but they talk about, heat wave, so many people died. Always wonder about that myself. How do they know? Did the guy die because, he had a heart disease and the heat just got to him? Do you count that as he died because of the heat or because he, had these? Well, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. When they got to the end of these 10 days in triple-digit temperatures, they knew they had a mess on their hands. But they literally were not able to put a number on how many people died till months after that 10-day period. And again, if you're like me, I'll just go there for a minute, because when I hear stuff like that, I go back to how can you tell it was the heat problem? Maybe it's because the guy was malnourished, or the guy had, this medical issue or that medical issue. How do you parse those things out? That's probably why it took them so long. Because you know what, at the end of 10 days, I don't mean to be so, crass here or whatever, but you got 500 dead bodies, so what do? You look at them and say, well, that one died of heat, that one, how do you do this? I'm speaking out of ignorance here, and I know I'm showing that because what I've read about this fascinates me. And number one, that whole idea of how do you determine whether it was, if they died from heat or some other thing, that's not a big issue for the people who assess these sorts of things. That was not the problem. That's not the reason it took them so long to find out how many people died. Months after this 10-day period, they calculated that 739 people died in Chicago from 10 days of excessive heat. And why did it take them so long? It wasn't because it was hard to figure out. It took them that long to find the bodies. Would you just let that sink in for just a minute? We're talking about millions of people in just a few square miles crammed in one of the most densely populated areas in our country, and it took them months to find some of the bodies? Yeah, that's right. So many people in such a crowded city are a vivid, terrible illustration of the crowded world in which we live, that you can be around a mess of people and still be all alone. People who lived next to people that they didn't even know their name smelled a stench, and they would call, and the authorities would come knock down the door, and they would find, time and time again, somebody had totally gone unnoticed, a corpse sitting in a chair with many times letters in the room or even next to the chair where the body was found. Letters that said, "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Can't we make things right again?" Reaching out to people that they once knew or considered friends. Does that bother you? That's 1995, and surely, we've learned our lesson, and we have all sorts of community outreach, and we do all sorts of things so that people are not left alone. And yet the very sociologists that are concerned about this great problem, that have been tracing this before 1995, from the mid-'80s till today, will also tell you that people are more alone now with social media and everything else. They are more alone now. The more people there are, we are more alone now than we have ever been before. In fact, one of the statistics that just frightens me is back in the mid-1980s, the number of Americans who would tell you that they had 0 people that are so close that they could talk about things in life that really matter. That number of people from the 1980s till today has tripled in our country. Does that bother you? In 2016, there were 63,632 people in our country who died from drug overdoses. For decades, the number one killer in our country has been on the roads, highway accidents. But in 2016, more than double, or nearly double that number that died on our roads, died from drug overdoses. In fact, that same year, 2016, we had in excess of 45,000 people. In fact, again, more than died on our roads. We had in excess of 45,000 people take their own lives. Is that a sign of something? I almost hesitate to bring this up, but I got to bring this up. When we talk about gender dysphoria and the transgender issue, and I know there's a lot to be said here, and God is not silent on this issue. But at the end of the day, did you realize that people who are in the transgender community commit suicide at a rate 19 times greater than the epidemic is for the rest of us? There's a lot of pain and suffering. Listen, the point maybe I'm not making very well, but the point I'm trying to go to is this. This is not some third world country. This is America. And what do we have? We've not been attacked. We're not at war. There's not some great plague or disease. We are literally, as a community of people, dying of despair. And I'll tell you why this so beyond aggravates me. Because it's like living amongst the people who are going to die if they can't get something to drink, and you and I've got the water by the gallons. Our message is a message of hope, and they're dying all around us from despair. That is why, one of many reasons why we need to listen to passages like this, because it speaks of getting a message of hope to a world that's lost in so many ways, that's living in despair. And you talk about a city that was going under. It was ancient Athens. Let's just get this one verse. We're just going to start it today. There's a lot we have to say about this. We'll continue this next week. But I don't want to go too quickly because there's too much here. One verse, in fact, this one verse, there are just 3 words. You're going to say, wow, it takes so long just to... Yeah, we're just going to focus on 3 words. But let's go ahead and read the verse, and then we'll focus on those 3 words. It's verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed. Okay, I know that's 2 words in English, but it's really coming from one Greek word. Greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. This is such an interesting verse. It could be translated in so many different ways. In fact, John R.W. Stott used to say it's better to translate this, that Paul saw something, and what he saw was a city that was literally submerged. It was going under. They were drowning. Why? Because they're idols. Here are the 3 words, and 3 words that I hope make a difference in our life and help us better get a message of hope to a world that's just lost in despair all around us. Here they are. The first word, greatly distressed, it's just one word in the Greek language, and it means Paul was mad. Hot and bothered. I don't care how you say it, as long as it's really negative. He was mad. We're going to look at the word mad. We're going to look at the word see. We're going to look at the word idol. So here we go. Paul was mad. Are you allowed to be mad? Doesn't the Bible say, put away anger and things like that? Listen, this word that's translated distressed, provoked, upset, angry, depending on your translation, you kind of get the flavor of it, but in the original language, the Koine Greek that this was originally recorded in, This word's not used very often in the New Testament. In fact, if you want to figure out what this word really means, you always tell a word by its usage, right? But if you want to really understand this word and what it means, you're going to have to go to the Old Testament. Well, wait a minute. I thought the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Yeah, but before Jesus' day, it was translated into the Greek language. We refer to it as the Septuagint. And the way they translated it sometimes is very helpful. Well, this word, same word used here to talk about Paul's emotion, how he felt, is used many times in the Old Testament, and almost always when it's used in the Old Testament, it's talking about God. And it's those passages, at first it's going to get worse, and then hopefully I actually hope this is helpful. But at first, you try to understand a little bit more. But you go to the Old Testament where this word's used, and you know what? It's used in a bunch of places that people don't like. Why? Because it's usually used to talk about the jealousy and wrath and anger of God. And I'll just be real honest, a lot of people are like, well, that doesn't help. I didn't like those passages, right? Well, it caused me to go back and do a little extra research. In fact, I was listening to this one sermon I heard years ago, re-listened to it. And I tell you what, did me such a world of good. And it's just a reminder, when you think of anger and jealousy and wrath and being hot and bothered, however you want to say it, when you think of those kind of words, yeah, sometimes that gets misused, but it's not always bad. Listen, here's what this preacher said in preaching on the jealousy of God in the Old Testament. He said, foundational work here, first thing you need to understand is the opposite of love is not hate. Especially when you look at it in biblical context. Think about this with me. The opposite of love is not hate. We like to think of God as a God of love, and many times he's presented as a God of love. And that's why we get ourselves into trouble, because we think, well, this is the opposite of love if he has this anger, so how can it be the same God? Because the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. Think about that for just a minute, especially if love is a commitment. It's an action. It's not just a feeling. It's not just emotion. It's getting involved for the good of the other person. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference, sitting back and doing nothing, not caring. In fact, this very attitude that sometimes we have difficulty with, this idea of anger and being upset, sometimes, folks, think about this, sometimes that's a demonstration of a great love. I know this, I say it many times because this is kind of my go-to illustration. Every time I think about this, I think of a dad. What kind of a dad would stand in a dark alley and watch his teenage daughter be molested and not be mad? Mad enough to do something, maybe even something violent about what's taking place there. I'm telling you, I think if he gets upset, the more he gets upset, the more he intervenes, is a demonstration of his love. Are you following me here? Listen, this false contradiction sometimes about being upset and being mad, it's not an indication of something that's sinful. It can be sometimes, but not with God and not the way he wants us to be. No, sometimes it's the very thing that God is looking for. Let me give you a New Testament illustration. Let's pick on a guy named Jesus. That'd be a good one, wouldn't it? You do know that he went into the temple of the day, and more than once, early in his ministry, late in the ministry, he did what we call cleansing of the temple. How do you clean up a temple? With a whip. You remember the story, how he goes in, turns the tables upside down, drives the people out. But what a lot of people miss here, it's found in Mark, the 11th chapter, when it talks about Jesus clearing the temple. It's not just it's a den of robbers. It's not just they were doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. You know who else Jesus drove out there? Not just the money changers, not just the people selling stuff. He also drove out the people who were using the courtyard area as a shortcut. Go back, check me out, Mark chapter 11. You know what it's talking about? Jesus got mad, not just at stuff that should not be. Jesus got mad at people who were indifferent to something that they should have had some feeling about. Okay, I know I'm taking way too long here, so I need to move on to the next word. I just want to make this point. There are some things as God's people that ought to bother us. Can I just put this up towards the top of the list? Living in the midst of a world who's thirsty for a drink from the well that you and I represent. That ought to grieve our souls. What's the next word? Let me put the next two words together. He saw a city submerged in idols. He saw the idols. The reason I want to focus on these next two words, the word see, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but there's something really rich here. The typical word that's translated see, blepo, is the Greek word. It just means I see. That's not the word used here. And every time not the normal word is used in a place, it's kind of like, whoa, I wonder why not. Well, there's another word for seeing things in the Greek language, and it's theoreo. It's the word from which we get to theorize. That's the word used here. In other words, the Apostle Paul didn't just open his eyes and see a bunch of idols all over the place. No, he perceived. He understood. He saw the significance. He didn't just look at his world. He surmised. He evaluated. And he understood what the problem was. What was the problem? He saw that their world was submerged, was overrun with idols. And no doubt, you're going to look this up. If you look this up and you're going to see ancient Athens, you're going to see all sorts of wood and metal and stone idols all over the place. But those were not the only kind of idols that Athens had. There are idols you cannot see with your eyes. That's another reason I think he used this special word for seeing. What's the definition of an idol? Anything that gets between you and God. Anything that takes the place of where God should be in your life. Here's the way one commentator put it, and I just so like this. If there is something wrong with our world, or just you're part of the world, look for the idol. If there's something wrong with the United States of America today, look for the idols. If there's something wrong with your family, look for the idols. If there's something wrong at the workplace or your relationship with some other person or just in your own life, look for the idols. That's what this verse is telling us. So I want to back up and hit it from a different angle because I don't want you to miss this. This is, when Jesus was asked, you can find this a couple different places, but in Matthew 22nd chapter, verses 38 and 39, Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? Do you remember this? Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And here's Jesus' response. The greatest commandment, he didn't say, well, you can't do that. No, he gave an answer. He said, the greatest commandment is this, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second, he went ahead and added, the second is very much like it. It's to love your neighbor as yourself. Then he makes this comment. This is in verse 39. He says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two. Can I just say that one more time? All the law and the prophets hang on these two. What does he mean by that? Well, one of the things he means by that is this. You get God first and nothing else in that place. You've got it all. It's a positive way of making the negative point that if there's any problem in your life, any relationship, any family, any group that you're a part of, if there's a problem there, there's an idol there. Well, let me make it one more way. In John the 4th chapter, Jesus meets a woman outside the city of Sychar going for water. Do you remember this story? We usually refer to her as the woman at the well. And he starts up a conversation with her. But at one of the key points, Jesus discloses, he said, if you only knew who was asking you for a drink of water, you'd be asking of me, and I could give you water where you will never thirst again. Listen, I know when Jesus says full disclosure, it's not going to be an easy life. You're going to be attacked. There's going to be all sorts of hardships that you're going to have to face. But you know what? If you're looking for the satisfied life, if you're looking for the fulfilled life, if you're looking for the life that you were created to have, Jesus has it. Total satisfaction. And if you don't have that, it's because something has gotten between you and Jesus. It's a positive way of saying the same negative thing that this tells us about Athens. Do you see it? Do you get it? If there's a problem, there's an idol. And I think you already know this, but in my estimation, the number one idol today is happiness. Why do people rob from one another? Why would they take something that belongs to somebody else? Because they think it'll make them happy. Why do people let you down and not keep promises that are made? Because at the end of the day, they think that would cost too much and I'd rather be happy. Why do people give up on marriage commitments and ignore and abuse children? Because in our culture, it's usually they think, that's too hard and I want to be happy. It's just one illustration of this principle. If there's any problem at all, look for the idol. Listen, family, God's people. Jesus said, as often as we meet, we're supposed to take time to come to the table, to come take some bread and take some juice to remember his death. And usually we focus on the fact he died for us. Very true, very true. We remember what Jesus did on the cross. But Jesus on the cross did not just take care of the problem of sin. Jesus on the cross became king. According to Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, he defeated Satan and made a public spectacle out of him. He sat on his throne. We don't just remember someone who died for us as our Savior. We come to these tables to remember he's our King. What does that mean? My King deserves my allegiance. And if I have allowed some idol to get between me and my King, I've got to lay it down and take those emblems again and say, you died not just to save me, you died to be my King. Do you get this? Because I'm telling you, it's a sick world and it ought to bother us. But you know why it's sick? Because there's something between us and God. Let's lay that down. When you're ready, would you come to the table and remember your King?